Good evening. Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us. This webinar tonight has been organised by Kalbar, and it's about the key environmental effects statement findings of the Fingerboards Mineral Sands project. Now, we're often referred to this as the EES, and that's how we'll be referring to it this evening as well. My name is Josie Taylor, and I'm your moderator for this evening. Before we begin, I wish to respectfully acknowledge the Gunkanai people as the traditional custodians on the land on which we are meeting. We pay respects to their elders past and present in honouring their ongoing cultural and spiritual connections to this country. The land we are meeting on is the traditional lands of the Brabalung people, one of the 5 clans of the Gunkanai Nation. Now, allow me to explain how we're going to run tonight's live streaming session. This is a summary of key findings. Far more information is available on the Fingerboards website. And if you haven't already, I strongly encourage you to go onto the site. There is a video, there's various reports, there's lots of summaries, and there's Q&A documents that will help you better understand the questions that you may have about the project. But the ESS itself is structured into 8 themes, and therefore we're going to use the same 8 themes to structure tonight. So we've organised all of the findings of each of the research reports that contribute to the ESS by these 8 themes. And I'll walk you through these in the next slide so that you understand how we're going to run the flow and the time we're going to take. Our plan is to spend about 15 minutes on each theme. And to do this, we're going to spend about 5 minutes on each, providing an overview of the key findings, and then open up to 10 minutes to answer the questions that are related to that specific theme. Now, as many of you know, Kalbar invited people to pre-submit questions prior to tonight. So as of about 20 minutes ago, as we were finalising question lists that have come in, we've received more than 60 questions. And we sincerely thank you for the interest in the project and you taking the time to pre-submit questions. Now, we said that what we would do tonight is prioritise the questions that were pre-submitted that were directly related to the ESS findings. Questions, however, can be submitted throughout the webinar. So you'll see that there's a link that you can actually send in your questions that you have. We have a couple of people here that are collecting the questions that will bring us in here into the production room. Now, I've got to point out that the questions won't appear on the screen. So, for example, if you watch Q&A or some other TV programs, you'll notice that down the bottom of the screen is like a ticker or a feed of comments and questions that have come in. Given the complexity that we have with today with webinars, we have some of our technical experts from Toowoomba to Tasmania. Victor Hugo, who many of you will know, is still in Perth because of COVID. He's unable to travel, and we have people here in Bairnsdale. So to ensure that everyone has a good experience and we don't have any issues with the platform, part of my job will be to read out the questions and then ask our technical experts to respond in a way that's most appropriate to their areas of study as well. Now, let me set some expectations for the session. It is physically impossible for us to get to all the questions that we've pre-received, let alone the questions that have come in now. So our commitment to you, or Kalbar's commitment, is that all questions that have been submitted, whether they are about the findings we're going to talk about in this webinar, or indeed other things related to Kalbar, such as how do I become a supplier, or how do I find a job at Kalbar, or whatever those sort of adjunct questions, Kalbar will respond to them in writing through a refreshed Q&A document that will be published on the website. And as per previous community sessions they've had, they're going to take up to 7 working days to be able to respond. So please know that if you've submitted a question and we're just unable to respond to it today, we will be able to do that in writing for everyone to see on the website. Now, Before we go into the next slide, I also want to introduce Anthony, who is our technology provider. We're not going to put the camera on Anthony right now, but Anthony's in the room with me and he's central control managing the cameras and the microphones for all of our presenters. So firstly, I ask for your patience as we switch to people. Anyone that has done Zoom or other kinds of webinars or other kinds of online meetings knows sometimes there can be some technical glitches. But what you'll also hear tonight is that we will say something like, Anthony, next slide, please, because he's also pushing the presentation along. So having said that, Anthony, if you could go to the next slide, please. While we're talking about technology, as with any time, there's always a slim chance that we have some issues with the webinar tonight. Now, we have tested this platform extensively over the last week, but if there is a problem, what we would ask you to do is go to the website and then there'll be an error message, something like what you're seeing on the screen. So if you do have an issue, we suggest that you try to rejoin again with your device. It might be something locally, but if it's something big, if it's something that's happened here in Bairnsdale, we will put up a message on the website and tell you how to rejoin and maybe to give us 10 minutes to reboot and get it sorted. So any problems, just go to the website and follow those instructions that are on there. Now, Anthony, if you don't mind going to the next slide, I just want to give folks an overview of the themes and the approximate timings and the experts. So as you can see, we have an action-packed agenda. And we have allowed those 15 minutes, and you can see on the right hand side of the screen the list of technical experts. These are the folks who have largely been involved, either driven or authored the reports or been involved in the studies, who are available online to answer the questions that you may have, and will also be responding as part of those written Q&A. And we thank them very much for their time. And as I said, they're spread all across Australia. So really appreciate people making time in different time zones as well. We'll also use this image as a mark, if you like, throughout the presentation to actually signify to you. So you'll know we're moving, we'll say it, but you'll see visually that we're moving on to the next theme. So if it is in bold, if the words are in bold, that means that is the section that we're going into next. So we're going to go into an introduction, and I'm going to introduce the gentleman next to me. So Anthony, next slide, please. So to introduce the session, I'm joined by the relatively new Kalbar CEO, Joseph Padarica. Joseph, thank you for joining us. I know that you're relatively new to Kalbar, and I'm going to assume that there are some people who may not have met you before. I'm just wanting you to give a little bit of an overview about yourself for the folks at home.
Sure, thanks Josie. Yeah, look, I've been in the mining industry for close to 30 years, and in that time I've been involved in several mining developments and managed operations across Australia and overseas. I've lived in regional Victoria for the past 16 years. I moved here from Western Australia to develop the Fosterville gold mine, which is close to Bendigo. My most recent mineral sands experience has been in West Africa, where I was the CEO of the in-country mineral sands mining company. And our mining activities there operated successfully alongside the local vegetable farmers who really benefited from our ongoing rehabilitation as we moved through the mine path.
Okay, great. And so what will people see over the next couple of hours?
Yeah, so tonight over the next 2 hours, we will present and provide an opportunity for questions related to, I guess, each of the key findings of the EES, as Josie sort of mentioned in the lead up. And as you can see, I think on your screen, we'll go through a summary of all the key findings. You know, the scope of that was defined by the Minister for Planning and also informed by government policy and legislation. And there's been more than 30 technical studies that have been completed, and they've been really organised around the 8 themes that we talked about earlier. And look, they identify the potential positive and negative impacts of the project. And I guess the important thing is that the full findings of the EES, of all the technical reports will be in the EES report, and we're working very closely with government to move to this public exhibition phase.
Okay. Terrific. So Shall we kick off?
Yeah, and as Josie said, we're joined by Victor Hugo, the former CEO of Kalbar, who's really been intimately involved in the EES process, and he'll be presenting a summary of each of the key findings ahead of the opportunity to ask questions.
Excellent. So thank you very much, Joseph. I really appreciate that. Let us go on to resource development. Victor.
Thank you, Josie. I hope you can hear me.
I can, and I'm sure the folks.
All right. Okay, great. Well, good evening, everybody, and thank you for joining this session. I'm going to introduce each of the 8 key findings. So I'll start with resource development, but I will ensure that I keep these findings as brief as possible to give as much time to our specialists to answer your questions. So in terms of resource development, as you can see on the slide, the Fingerboards deposit is unique in that it has some of the highest grades of zircon in the world, and it's what we call a tier 1 deposit in terms of both the grade and the size of the resource. So it is something that in mining terms is very special, and in conjunction with that, the analysis that we have done and continue to do on the zircon market, and for that matter, the rare earth market and titanium markets, indicates that zircon in particular will grow at a rate of about 2.5% per year over the long term. And as a result of that, there is a predicted supply gap, which this project is very well positioned to fill. We've done fairly extensive, not just technical, but also economic analysis of the project itself, and looked at it in terms of the net economic benefit to Victoria. And essentially, that benefit is almost $400 million, of which about $159 million are in direct benefits, so directly flowing out from the project itself, and about $234 million are in indirect benefits. So the flow and effects of having a primary industry in regional Victoria. So with that, Josie, I'll hand back to you in terms of questions.
Excellent. Thank you, Victor. So your first question actually is related, I think, to the last point that you made. So we have a question in, can you advise what factors are included in arriving at the net economic benefit of the Fingerboards project? For example, what's included in the CBA? And I'm not actually sure what the CBA is, so I'm wondering if you could help clarify that too, Victor.
Sure. So CBA is essentially what it's called a cost benefit analysis. It is a technique used by economists to look at not just the financial benefits of a project or an activity such as a new mine, but to actually look at all the impacts of both the positive and the negative impacts. So it takes into account the multitude of factors such as water, housing, the infrastructure, public infrastructure, cultural heritage, etc. So there's a fairly long list of factors that are considered when doing this analysis. And in essence, a project is deemed to be beneficial to the population or the region when what is called the net present value, in other words, the value discounted back to today, is positive. So if it's greater than 0, then the project is deemed to have a positive effect in terms of its development.
Okay.
Thank you.
Great, thank you. So the next question is, how was the loss of the environmental values costed?
So it really does vary between the different values. So for example, if you take water, we had to consider factors such as the building of any dams or retention of water over the life of the mine, and then the cost of actually decommissioning those dams. If you take into account factors such as housing, then you need to consider what impact any influx of workers, for example, both short and long term, would have on housing demand and therefore housing prices. And so each of those factors is considered in its own right and included in the overall economic assessment.
Thank you. So given the report covers the life of the mine, did it include costs of rehabilitation?
Yes, it did. So all of the rehabilitation costs and closure costs have been included in the economic assessment.
Super. Now, the next question is a little bit long, so bear with me, but I want to make sure that I read it out exactly as the committee member submitted it. So, was any modelling done on unfortunate but not unlikely events that could impact on operations and profitability over the next 15 to 20 years, such as oversupply of markets, effects of drought, infrastructure, for example, dam failure?
Yes, there were. So various sensitivity analyses and scenarios were run as part of the modelling. We looked at things like pricing, it looked at aspects such as costs, etc. And the worst case scenario, or the most pessimistic scenario that was modelled through the sensitivity analysis, still demonstrated that the net benefit would be about $289 million in NPV terms.
Super. Thank you. Thanks, Victor. And look, one last question. So it's on a slightly different tangent, this, but were the effects of competition for labour included in this part of the report or in some other part? So I think overall in the summary is what the question's asking.
Yeah, yes, it was. So certainly the competition for labour is addressed in the economic assessment, and it does look at the cost and potential impact of labour competition on other industries such as agriculture, and that is covered off in the socio-economic impact assessment as well.
Okay, great. Victor, thank you so much for your time. We might, Anthony, go to the next slide, and we will begin to look at biodiversity. So I know that biodiversity is an issue that we have a lot of questions on. And so, Victor, if I can invite you to run through those findings, and then I have a whole series of questions for various people on the panel. So, Victor, over to you.
All right. Thank you, Josie. There's 2 slides on biodiversity. The key findings regarding biodiversity is that most of the project area is already highly modified and supports only low diversity values, mainly because it's dominated by pasture and plantations. And where you do find remnant, or where you do find native vegetation, that tends to be in remnant patches along roadsides and drainage lines. And probably of equal importance is that we have identified all the scattered and remnant trees within the project area. So each one of those is accounted for. And we have, through our biodiversity surveys, identified the range of flora and fauna species, and that a lot of these actually are locally common throughout the region. So there's nothing that is unique to the actual project area itself. We've looked at not just what is within the project area, but also the wider area. And in particular, we've looked at the Gippsland Lakes, and that was part of the Commonwealth requirements with regard to this environmental assessment. And what we found with regard to the Gippsland Lakes is that they are not directly impacted. And the reason for that is that the assessments that we've done have determined that there is no or very little adverse impact on the Mitchell or Perry rivers, and therefore the lakes themselves are unlikely to be impacted. I think the other thing to point out is that what we find is that the residual impacts related to the project tend to be on a local level, but not on a state or national level. So with that, we'll go to the next slide. Thank you. The other key findings and relate really to a summary of the ecological values, and in particular the sort of fauna and flora that we've identified through our survey. So importantly, we have one nationally listed threatened ecological community, which is the red gum, the Gippsland red gum grassy woodland community, and there's about 1.74 hectares of that would be disturbed through mining activities. And again, most of those relate to moving roads or realigning roads within the project area. There's a number of fauna species, in particular 2 nationally significant fauna species are possibly found within the project area and the surrounding area, and those are the grey-headed flying fox, which is a bat, and the Australian grayling, which is a fish. And there's a number of other species that I won't necessarily list here. You can read them on the screen. And there are also 4 flora species within the area that are considered as rare. And we've identified 11 ecological vegetation classes, which is important because when we look at rehabilitation and restoration, these classes need to be taken into consideration. So I think with that, Josie, I'll hand back to you for questions.
Thank you, Victor. Really appreciate your summary on that. We've got several questions actually that are coming about biodiversity. And I think Aaron, we've got Aaron Organ, who's from Ecology Heritage Partners, who's on the line. I think that these ones are for you, Aaron. So the first one we've received is, how confident are you that the field investigations have adequately documented the ecological values across the project areas?
Thanks, Josie. Thanks, everyone. Thanks for joining us. It's a really good question. It gets asked a lot, and it's an important question to answer because particularly given this project is going through one of the highest or the highest assessment process from ecological perspective, so an environmental effects statement. We've been engaged since June 2016. So over the last 4 years, undertaken extensive surveys, terrestrial, aquatic surveys on a range of species, including targeted surveys through recommendations through our staff and also through engaging with DELP and the Commonwealth relating to giant Gippsland earthworm, Australian grayling, which Victor mentioned, a number of flora species, and also documented detailed mapping and quality of the vegetation across the project area. So it's a fairly extensive survey over multiple survey seasons.
Excellent. Thank you. So next question, what offsets do you have to provide?
That's a good question as well. Yeah, so for any project across Victoria where there's a proposed impact on native vegetation, there's a state government policy, so the native vegetation guidelines that needs to be considered, and then also above that is the Commonwealth Environment Protection and Biodiversity Conservation Act. So the listed ecological communities, the main consideration under the Commonwealth EPBC Act, which Victor mentioned, is probably approximately 1.74 hectares. And then there's a range of state offsets required for the project.
And so I think this is a follow-on question. It's actually from the same community member. So how have the offsets needed to be calculated? And is it possible for you to itemise each class?
That's a good one. So yeah, look, with the state offsets, the process is that we collect the vegetation data, so the extent and the quality of each vegetation community, then provide that to DELP, so the Department of Environment, Land, Water and Planning. They then provide, it's called a native vegetation removal report. So they use our spatial data to then essentially produce a report that they run to ascertain or to determine what the offsets are. And so that is in the form of general biodiversity equivalence units and species habitat units. So general habitat units and species habitat units. So for this particular project, there's a requirement for both general and species habitat units. And then you've got the offsets under the Commonwealth, which I mentioned earlier. So yeah, it's quite a detailed process in collecting the data and then obtaining that report from DELP to determine what the offset liability is for the project. And it's also important to note that the offsets won't be secured and all agreed upon up front, because this project will go for a number of years. It'll be a staged approach to offsets.
Okay. Aaron, you might have answered part of this question in your previous answers, but let me know whether there's anything you can expand upon. So we have a question in, where are the biodiversity offsets, state and federal, coming from?
Yeah, so both state and Commonwealth offsets, the first priority is to try and locate them as close to the project area as possible. So there's been extensive surveys both adjacent to the project footprint or the infrastructure footprint, and then also more broadly across the East Gippsland Catchment Management Authority. So for the state offsets, those offsets for general units can be achieved in the relevant catchment. For species units, they can be achieved anywhere in the state of Victoria, but the sites that we've identified are quite good, and we're confident that we're going through a process now whereby securing and having agreements in place to fulfil that offset liability. So it's mainly within the local area, so within 50 to 100 kilometres, if not closer to the actual footprint of the project. In terms of the Commonwealth offset, that's again, will be in Gippsland, because that's where that Commonwealth listed community is restricted to. So it's not as if it can be secured, you know, in northeast Victoria or central Victoria. It needs to be where that community occurs, which is down through Gippsland, so the River Red Gum, Gippsland Red Gum community.
Okay, and another question that's come in, are you claiming the work of Paul Gibson Roy in revegetating after the mine has finished as part of the offsets?
So there is a potential, so Paul will talk shortly, but there is a potential that some of that could be used to fulfill the project offsets, but it's probably only a very small proportion of the project, and it's probably only to do relating to the Commonwealth offset. So for the state offsets, revegetation can qualify, but that can only really generate general units, not species units. So although there's a proposal to rehabilitate using locally Indigenous species for that community, it's probably a very small proportion of the overall offset liability that can be achieved through that revegetation or restoration project. But still, there's an opportunity where we're discussing that with the regulators currently.
Okay. So Aaron, we have two more questions that have just come in through the live feed that are both related to trees. The first one is, how have the isolated trees been identified and valued?
That's a really good question. So trees are a pretty important biodiversity or ecological asset in the landscape. So we've gone out and we've pretty much mapped every single tree across the project footprint and looked at that in detail. So a lot of them do support hollows and do provide habitat for a range of fauna species. So we've actually done, that was one thing that was highlighted or identified through DELP, was, for example, marstow and other species, who have done targeted surveys for them. A majority of the trees to the south of the site through the haul road will be avoided. So there's opportunities to scoot around individual trees and do micro-siting. Unfortunately, in the actual footprint itself, there will be a number of large trees lost as part of that project. But as part of the as part of the offset process, there will be a requirement to adequately secure and find an equivalent number of trees in another area to permanently protect them to compensate for any proposed removal. But it's certainly been a key question for DELP and also the TRG, so the Technical Reference Group, have actually paid specific attention to those scattered trees because they do provide habitat.
Okay, so we have one last question. So a gentleman has written in and said, Aaron, I wrote to you asking why the two major areas of native bush on the project have not been evaluated as ecological units. Instead, your report just counts the trees. So why was that?
I might have to, I don't know what that specific question pertains to, but yeah, we follow the standard methodology to assess trees and assess patches as they are under the state guidelines. So I can't recall the specific area or thing in question, but certainly our surveys accord with the requirements for the department. So happy to take that on notice and get back to you on that particular question.
Perfect. Thank you. Appreciate your time. All right, let's move on to the next topic. So if Anthony, if you don't mind going to the next slide. So the next we're going to be talking about is water, catchment values and hydrology. I know another topic we have lots of questions in. So let me ask Victor to begin the discussion by sharing the summary findings.
Thanks, Josie. If we could go to the next slide, which should show those findings. Thank you. So a few things to highlight with respect to this section. Firstly, that we need to obtain licenses both for surface and groundwater from Southern Rural Water. So it's important to understand that those licenses need to be obtained and are yet to be obtained by the project. The other thing that the findings have, or the assessments have highlighted, is that there should be no impact to the availability of groundwater. And that is because whatever groundwater we extract for the project will be extracted from the Latrobe aquifer, or the Latrobe group aquifer, which is a fairly deep aquifer and doesn't impact on the water used by the local irrigators. The other thing to note is that we will need to buy existing groundwater licenses from other users, so there's no new licenses being granted for this project. In terms of risk and impact with regard to other facets of water, probably the one moderate risk that has been identified and mitigated is that we've recognized that if the temporary tailings storage facility fails, that could well have an impact, particularly on the Perry River catchment, because of the flow of tailings into some of the tributaries of that river. So that is very high on our list in terms of how we manage that, and ensuring that that tailings facility, which will only be there for about 5 years, is designed with all the safety precautions in mind and managed during the life of its existence to ensure that it does not fail. When we then look at all the other residual impacts and risks to the water resources and the value, so mainly the Mitchell River and the Perry River, we have determined that those impacts are low or very low. And as mentioned before, there's no expected impact on the Gippsland Lakes, Ramsar sites. The final point that I'll make is that we have already started and continue to undertake both surface and groundwater monitoring, and those will continue right through the construction, operation, and rehabilitation closure of the project. And those are there to ensure that if we start to see any adverse impacts from the mining activity, that we can actually put in place corrective action. And those sort of actions have already been identified. So for example, if we, through our monitoring, determine that groundwater mounding is increasing to levels that we need to intervene, then we can put in place extraction bores to lower the groundwater, for example. And with that, Josie, I will hand back to you for questions.
Thank you so much. I appreciate that, Victor. So we have on the line Tony McAllister from WaterTech. So Tony, I think this question is perfect for you. And one of the things I really like about this question is that it refers to the video presentation that's on the website that I referred to earlier when we began the webinar, which has a lot more information. So we're going to test you, Tony, with your knowledge about what's on that video. So the question is, on a diagram dated 24th of March 2020, in the video presentation of the EES key findings, it shows that there are 20 dams. that Kalbar proposes to build on the 1,675 hectares of the Fingerboards mine projects. So the question is, what is the purpose of the dams labelled 2 through to 20 on the diagram?
Oh, thanks very much, Josie, and I really do hope that I passed the test that you've set me. Water Technology, a company with an office in Bairnsdale, we're obviously passionate about making sure this project succeeds. And we've worked closely to come up with a strategy with the other consultants, and these dams are essential to that strategy. The dams basically manage rainfall and runoff on the site. We look very carefully at the different streams of water on the site, clean water, water that might be affected by some of the mining operations, and make sure that all of the dams work together in a systematic process whereby we make the maximum use of the water that falls on the site. We take the water that is clean and divert it around the site, and we capture the water, reuse it as appropriate to make sure, as Victor said, that the downstream environmental values are protected. It's a pretty interesting system, and I'm really excited about seeing it hopefully move forward.
So, Tony, we have a follow-up question. I'm not sure how much you've answered it, but it's related to the same diagram, and it says, why does Kalbar need to build dams on the gullies?
Oh, I could be very arrogant and smart and sit there and say water doesn't flow up hills, Josie, but I wouldn't do that.
But you won't. You won't.
Gullies are the perfect places to capture the water that comes off the site. It's a convenient, very logical place whereby water flows downhill. We capture it in the gullies, we store it in the gullies, and then, as I said earlier, it's either stored until it's cleaned and suitable to be released, or it's stored such that it can then be captured and moved elsewhere within the site for internal usage, dust control, supplying revegetation in areas that have already been mined. This project will go over a number of years. We need water for a whole bunch of purposes, and there's a good rationale for the need for all of those dams. Sorry.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Tony. Really appreciate it. We have
Anytime.
a question now around water and prioritisation for farmers and communities. And John Sweeney from Coffee, I think this might be one that you can speak to. So the question is, are safeguards put in place that the water required by farmers and communities get priority over the mine requirements at all times?
Thanks, Josie. In short, the answer is yes. There are safeguards. So for surface water, Kalbar will be seeking a winter fill licence. What that means is that the water would only be taken during periods of high flow. So the licence will have restrictions even during that period. So if the passing flow reduces below 1,400 megalitres per day, the extraction will stop. And typically farmers and other year-round licence holders will have still have access to water below that level, and they can continue to extract water in line with their licence conditions. For a groundwater allocation, Victor's already touched on a few of the details there. So the system is already allocated, and in order for Kalbar to gain a groundwater licence, they need approval from Southern Rural Waters, and they need to secure an allocation from another user who's looking to sell their entitlement. And in conjunction with that, for the groundwater, for approval for a groundwater licence, Kalbar's done some modelling to confirm that if that process is approved and they extract groundwater, that there won't be any interference with other nearby registered users. So there are some of the safeguards that have been conducted so far.
Okay, thank you. Thanks, John. I appreciate that. I think the next question is also for you. How much water will be prevented from going into the Mitchell annually as a result of the dams?
Yeah, so Tony's introduced the idea of the dams and what they're for. So the idea is to retain the water that's coming in contact with active mining areas. So the modelling suggests that somewhere between 130 and 270 megalitres per year will be retained in those dams and prevented from flowing into the Mitchell River. Now that equates to about 0.01% of the annual flow in the Mitchell River. So that in itself is a small volume, but to really remove any impact at all, Kalbar's committed to offsetting that water that's retained in the dams. So that'll be done by releasing fresh water from the freshwater storage and sent back to the Mitchell River, just so that there's no net loss.
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you very much for your time. So we have another question, which I think is best for, we have Joel from EMM Consulting. Joel, we have a question. So what's interesting to me about this is that the person who's taken the time to send us the questions feels that they've received some contradictory information from Kalbar in the past about this question. So now's the time for us to clarify it. And the question is, what is the actual depth below sea level that Kalbar intends to extract water from in its proposed bore field? Joel, are you able to
Thanks,
respond to that?
Josie. Thank you very much. Yes, I can answer that. So Kalbar have been committed to spend the time, money and effort in understanding the deep aquifers in the region and what's viable. So the deep aquifer in the region is known as the Latrobe Group aquifer. And the reason why this aquifer has been chosen is, yes, it yields good water from production bore, but it's also, as Victor's touched on before, it's very isolated from other third-party users and environmental receptors. So the investigations to date that were undertaken during the EES have indicated that these bores will take water greater than 300 metres below ground level at the bore field site itself, corresponding to a sea level. Pump inlets would be greater than 200 metres below mean sea level.
Okay.
Thank you.
So Joel, we actually have a live question that's just come in that I think is related to that. What is the total amount of water available to Kalbar to access from the aquifers?
Yep, no worries. So the total amount of water that's viable, that's been set by Southern River Water, is 27 gigs a year. As John and Victor have already mentioned, this water is fully allocated already. So there's no new allocations allowed to be released. Kalbar, out of those users, Kalbar have to go into negotiating for a transfer of licenses from unused water. So there's no new or no additional water being applied for. It has to be transferred from existing users. So that volume annually available is 27 gig, but not all that volume is actually used at any one point in time. So yeah, I hope that answers the question.
I think it does. So thank you so much. So we have a couple more live questions that have come in. Tony, we have a follow-up actually from some of the comments that you made around gullies. So the question is, how much consideration has been given to farmers who rely on water from the gullies, including the irrigators?
Yeah, thank you, Josie. Yeah, obviously carefully considered. Through the course of preparing the EES, we undertook consultations with Southern Rural Water, with East Gippsland CMA, in terms of consultation about the users of water and how the operations relate to those users. There's also legislative requirements under law in Victoria. There's a section 67 of the Water Act we need to consider. All of these things have to be taken into consideration in terms of the configuration of the site to make sure that existing users are protected.
Okay. We've got a couple more questions for you, Tony, that just come in. One is, how many years will those sediment control dams need to be retained if the regeneration doesn't work?
That's a bit of a rhetorical question, isn't it? Because if the regeneration doesn't work, they need to be there forever. But the regeneration will be able to work. It's a matter of simply Kalbar being custodians of the site, managing land appropriately and making sure that the revegetation works. Yeah, so they'll be there until the revegetation is established.
Great. Thank you for clarifying that. And one last one for this section for you. How can Kalbar ensure that does not impact on the Gippsland Lakes Ramsar listing?
The simplest answer I can give to that one is that we've done very exhaustive studies to give us a lot of confidence that any potential impacts can be managed by the extensive water management regime that I talked about. This is not just a dig a hole in the ground and run away exercise. As well as the water management regime, there will be a fairly extensive and exhaustive monitoring regime required to actually measure how the site's operating and what's going on. So there'll be an adaptive process go on so that as the site is developed, we will learn how things operate and make sure we feed that knowledge back into ongoing operations. So I'm quite confident that we'll be able to achieve no impact on the Gippsland Lakes.
Fantastic. Thank you, Tony, and thank you to all of our experts for that particular theme. We're now going to move on to the next theme. So, Anthony, if we can have the agenda back up. So we're next going to talk about the amenity and environmental quality section of the presentation. And once again, Victor, I'd like to call upon you just to provide an overview of the findings. So over to you, Victor.
Thanks, Josie. I'm going to, well, there's 2 slides on this section, which will cover off on air quality, greenhouse gas emissions, and then noise and health. So starting with air quality, we've done over 15 months of monitoring at site for a range of air quality parameters and use that monitoring to basically model the potential impact of air quality to what are called sensitive receptors. So those are people that may be living nearby, or they may be even the horticultural industry adjacent to the project area. What that modeling has determined is that under certain weather conditions, there may be exceedances, particularly of the what is called the PM10, so the 10 micron dust levels above, and those are exceedances above what is stipulated by the Victorian EPA. So in order to manage that, we need we continue to do the monitoring, but during construction operations and even rehab, we will continue to do real-time monitoring. Those monitors will be placed near sensitive receptors, and the locations will actually move according to what is, or where the mining activities are located, bearing in mind that mining will progressively move through the site. So a receptor may be close to the mining at one point, but then much further away at other times. And this monitoring in conjunction with what we effectively call predictive modeling of what those levels could be, taking into account weather, may actually result in us reducing, or in some cases, extreme cases, even ceasing mining activities if we have an indication that dust levels will be exceeded. In terms of greenhouse gases, that has been evaluated. Most of the greenhouse gas is generated from mobile equipment, so trucks, other equipment such as front-end loaders or dozers. The actual levels of emissions are very low in comparison to both national and state emissions. So we will obviously look at reducing greenhouse gas emissions as much as possible, but this is not one of the I guess, the most prominent impacts for the project. And with that, Anthony, if we could go to the next slide. So noise, again, we've done monitoring for noise, looked at noise impact on, again, what are termed sensitive receptors around the site. And that does indicate, well, based on the monitoring and the modeling that we've done, that does indicate that we may get exceedances of the noise criteria, particularly at night, without any mitigation. So we have looked at what mitigation we can put in place to ensure that noise levels meet the guidelines for, again, from construction through operations to rehabilitation and closure. Those sort of mitigations include the establishment of noise bunds, the use of mobile equipment that has the correctly fitted noise attenuation equipment. It also looks at just how plant equipment is located and utilized throughout the site. So if we do all those things, the modeling indicates that we will meet the guidelines. We've also looked at noise impact from transportation, particularly the product transport options. And we found that if we use our preferred option, which is to build a dedicated rail siding near Fernbank East and use a private hauler road, that has far less impact on receptors than any of the other options, which require ultimately trucks to drive through small towns along the way. This study also looked at vibration and has determined that the vibration generated from the project and associated activities are well below the guidelines. So vibration is not an issue for this particular project. Just finishing off with respect to health, we have done a health impact assessment of the project, looking mainly at what is the potential exposure of people to things like contaminants, so heavy metals, for example, or radiation. And in essence, this study has found that the risk of exposure to people, and I should actually say, and the environment in a much broader sense, is really no different from what exists under existing conditions. And so the health risk assessment has concluded that the risk profile from this project is both low and acceptable. And with that, Josie, I'll hand back to you for questions.
So we have several questions that have come in with regards to the topic. And I first wanted to ask, we've got Gillian Lee from Marshall Day Acoustics who's joined us. And Gillian, I think this question is probably best for you. It really is to understand what are the Victorian standards for noise pollution?
Thanks, Josie. So there are several guidelines for noise that are relevant to this project. Those different guidelines relate to different types of noise. The primary Victorian guideline for noise that's relevant to noise from operations, so that's day-to-day activities that will take place on the subject site, is called Noise from Industry in Regional Victoria, or NERV for short. That's a document that's published by the Victorian EPA, and it provides criteria as well as methodology for assessing noise from commercial operations at noise-sensitive receivers. For this project, the noise criteria defined under NERV is 46 decibels for the day period, 41 decibels for the evening, and 36 decibels for the night period. There are also some other guidelines that are relevant to this project. They are the EPA guidelines 1254 for construction noise and the New South Wales road noise policy, which, while not technically relevant in Victoria, it's a document that is commonly referred to provide guidance about short-term maximum noise levels at night that can cause awakening reactions or sleep disturbance. And it's also referred to for guidance on relative increases for heavy vehicle traffic on public roads due to projects such as this one.
Excellent, thank you so much. So we have a question that's come in that's around, I think dust management might be a good way to categorise it. So we have Tanya Haig from Capestone on the line. So thank you so much for joining us, Tanya. So the question is, how will Kalbar keep the dust down in the open areas of the mine?
Thanks, Josie. Well, there's a large number of dust management measures that Kalbar was used during construction and operations. And those are considered to be best practice measures that are used across the mining industry. Some of those include watering of haul roads and keeping overburden haul distances as short as possible through good mine planning, and also limiting vehicle speeds across the site. The ore is also proposed to be transported and processed as a slurry, so it would be wet, and so there wouldn't be any dust emissions from that part of the operation. And there's also tools like chemical suppressants that can be applied to exposed areas or haul roads. And exposed areas of ground would be minimised as well through planning and progressive rehabilitation, which would happen as soon as possible after mining is finished in each area. And as well as all those measures that would be applied routinely, there would be real-time dust monitoring around the mine. And if dust levels were increasing, then activities on site would be reduced or changed, or in some cases stopped completely. So all of those measures would be managing dust across the mine site.
That's terrific. Thank you, Tanya. I appreciate that insight. Our next question we have, Victor, I think this one might be for you. What noise and air quality monitoring will be done by Kalbar?
Thanks, Josie. As stated, we are doing continuous air quality monitoring at site, and we'll continue to do that. During construction operations, rehab and closure, we will have more dust monitors located in and or adjacent to the project area. And we'll also have continuous noise monitoring equipment. Now, importantly, that equipment will feed back into what I call a predictive management process, and that will integrate not just the levels that we are reading, but also the weather conditions and planned activities. So that will enable us to understand what levels would be reached if we did certain activities, and sort of manage our activities to ensure that I wouldn't say at all times, because there's always going to be some days when, due to external dust, there's just so much dust in the environment that there's nothing that we could do about or anything to prevent that from happening. But when it comes to our own operations, we can manage the dust to ensure that we don't have exceedances.
Okay, fantastic. Thank you. Thanks, Victor. Tanya, I'd like to just bring you back for a couple of questions, if I may. So the first one that we've received is, can Kalbar guarantee the product concentrate will not be blown around by the strong winds?
Thanks, Josie. Well, there's a few characteristics of the concentrate and how it's going to be stored that would make that unlikely. So when the concentrate is produced from the ore, it's actually produced into particles that are about 40 micrometers in size or larger. And those particles are also quite dense. So they're denser than sand. And so they're unlikely to be lifted up compared to other dust types of the same size. As well as that, the product stockpile is going to be damp because the material is wet coming out of the wet concentrate plant. And the wet concentrate plant and the product stockpile are proposed to be located within an existing blue gum plantation. So the trees that surround it would act as a windbreak to reduce wind speeds as well. So Kalbar are pretty confident that the product material is not going to be picked up and spread beyond that storage area.
Okay. So the final question I think we have for this section tonight is, what is the dust, and Tanya, this one's for you again, sorry. What is the dust depositation particle distribution at a distance such as 200 meters, 500 meters or a kilometre?
Yeah, okay. So that really does depend on a few different things. It depends on the year of operation throughout the mine life and where the activities are located. Depends also on the wind direction and the wind speed. So it will vary in different directions around the mine. But we have done some modelling to predict the worst case concentrations of airborne dust that are relevant from a human health perspective. And we've also done some modelling to predict dust deposition rates, which is how much dust falls back onto the ground, which can be a nuisance. And the modelling shows that with the project operating with all of the dust management controls that have been discussed already, the dust concentrations and dust deposition rates at all of the receptors close to the project would comply with all of the relevant air quality criteria. So I hope that answers that one, Josie.
It does, it does. Now, we've just had 2 more live Q&As come in, but we're actually right on schedule. So we're going to keep these 2 for the end of the session. We're just going to make sure we get through everything else. And then if we do have time, we'll go back to these 2. So Anthony, if you don't mind going, thank you very much to the folks that answered those questions. Let's go through the next slide. We are going to go now and have Victor introduce us to social land use and infrastructure. So Victor, over to you.
Thanks, Josie. Thanks, Anthony. Hopefully we don't have any glitches this time around. So the social land infrastructure, really, I'm going to cover off on the social economic aspects, the key findings related to horticulture, and then key findings related to roads and transport. So 2 slides for this section. In terms of the social findings, the biggest concerns that have been voiced by I guess the community, and this has been done through a number of workshops and obviously our engagement that we've done with the local community, is the potential impact on lifestyle. This is obviously a rural setting. People like a quiet rural lifestyle, and are concerned about the impact that mining will have on that. And then, equally important, there is a large and important horticultural industry adjacent to the mine, and concerns raised around what impact mining will have on that industry. I think we've spoken about how some of those impacts can be mitigated. So things like noise, dust. I'll talk later on about visual. But in essence, I believe that a key ingredient in terms of mitigating these concerns is to ensure that we follow what is called progressive rehabilitation, and I'm sure Rob Locke will add a little bit more to that later on. And that is that we progressively rehabilitate the areas that we're mining, such that things like exposed land, things like just the visual impact are minimized as the project progresses across the project area. The other important thing is that we put back the land, in our view, to the state that it was in, or even in a better state. And in most cases, the land will be restored back to whatever the pre-mining land use was. Although we have identified that in certain areas of land that is owned by Kalbar, where there's currently blue gum plantations, that we can establish much higher biodiversity values through the restoration program that we are planning on undertaking. So restoring over 200 or about 200 hectares of grassy woodland vegetation in those areas. The other important aspect in all of this is that is consideration for the existing landholders and ensuring that those landholders are adequately compensated for any disruption that they have to their livelihoods or lifestyles, and ensuring that in working with those landholders that we give the land back to them, again, in our view, in a better condition than it was when we started mining. With respect to the horticultural industry, the vegetable growers, probably the biggest impact that we see is potential competition for labor. There are quite a few categories of jobs where there will be overlap between the sort of people that we are looking for and the people that are currently employed. by that industry. And as I mentioned before, we're very sensitive to how we do this, and it's not our intention to poach employees from that industry. We would far rather certainly want to employ local people, but we'd far prefer to train people up for the sort of jobs that we're looking to fill. There's been a lot of discussion in many of our community consultation sessions around the impact that the mine could have on horticulture, and in particular dust. All of our modelling indicates that the dust depositional rates will be well within the quality criteria, and should not impact on the horticultural industry or the produce produced from that. And equally so, there are many examples of mining coexisting with agriculture or viticulture for that matter. And we do not see that there'll be a risk that the horticulturists will face a loss of market, or as a result of having a mine in proximity to their existing businesses. So with that, we'll go to the next slide, which should be on roads. So the key findings with roads is that, yes, it is our intention to relocate and realign a number of roads within the project area. And so there will be some works on roads. We will actually be upgrading some intersections, and potentially, depending on which option we ultimately go with, there could be some upgrades to roads across rail crossings. The intention is that our activities will have limited impact on the actual road network itself, and limited disruption to anybody using those roads. And again, our preferred option is to have a dedicated rail siding and a private haul road, which ensures that most of the vehicle movements associated with the mine actually are not on public roads at all. But if we did have to use public roads, and particularly looking at the more regional roads, or the main roads in the region, then truck movements on, say, the Princess Highway are really low compared to the overall traffic that is found on those roads. And probably the biggest contributor to traffic changes will be when we undertaking construction, which will be for a period of about 12 months in all. As I said before, our preferred option is to avoid transporting product on public roads at all. And with that, Josie, I'll hand back to you for questions.
Great, thank you so much, Victor. We have, Victor, several questions in, and I just want to ask you to respond to the first one, because it is about, I think, a point that you just made. So the question is, will all workers, both unskilled, such as the people that do the cleaning, as well as trained, experienced mine workers, will they be sourced from the local area?
Josie, we anticipate that about 80 to 85% of the 200 people that we will employ on a full-time basis for this project will be sourced locally. And those people, we anticipate, when we look at the demographics and the skills within the area, we believe that many of the sorts of jobs that we're looking for, plant operators, tradespeople, administrators, can be sourced from the local area. There are a number of jobs that are specialized in their nature, and where we may well have to employ people from outside of the region.
Okay, terrific. Thank you, Victor. The next question we have is actually around the findings of the EES regarding the impact on farming. And I actually would like to invite Dr. Doris Blasing from RMCG, who's here with us tonight. Dr. Blasing, are you on the line?
Yes, I am.
Excellent. Welcome, welcome. I
Thank you.
do believe you're our most southern participant down in Tasmania tonight. So thank you for joining us.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, I'm living in a beautiful agricultural area. So we looked at impacts on horticulture specifically, but there are relevant for agriculture. And one reason actually why we did that is because our heart is in the country. So we were very keen on actually looking at the technical reports, looking at case studies, looking at literature as required, and especially all the mitigation options and actions and the monitoring. And I guess, as we already heard from the technical experts, that we were very pleased about the extensive work that has been done, and are quite confident, we are confident that agriculture and the mining can coexist. And now that Victor talked about labor, and I think that can be an issue, especially in the short term. However, I guess one of the mitigation options is to actually keep talking to each other and working together. So these things can be resolved, we believe. And we had heard concerns about consumer reaction, and we know very much about the movement of right to farm, about sustainable production, and consumers very much care what farmers do on their land. However, what we also found that if people buy vegetables, fresh produce, the look and the freshness of it is the most important. So usually if you look at large scale production, it is really important how the vegetables are presented, and that the farmers can also show that they're produced sustainably, which these days vegetable producers do because they have very strict UI procedures for that. So bringing all that together, we're very confident that there's a happy coexistence down the line.
Excellent. Well, we like happy coexistence in everything. So thank you so much, Dr. Blessing. Really appreciate your feedback and your summary of that. Thank you. The next question we have, Victor, I think it's for you. I'm going to take a stab that it's from a teacher because it says, my senior students are very excited at the prospect of getting jobs in the mine if it's approved. And the question is, how much training and experience was required to drive a B double? What other sorts of jobs would you train them for?
Thanks, Josie. Look, a really good question, and certainly something that we are putting a lot of effort, are beginning to and will put a lot of effort to, and that is really ensuring that all people employed by Kalbar, whether they're directly employed by Kalbar or a contractor through a mining contractor or transportation contractor, are adequately trained and competent. So anybody that drives a B double will need to ensure that they have sufficient experience and training and capability to do so. I think for the exciting thing for kids leaving school is that there are quite a few different jobs, career opportunities that Kalbar will provide. And those range from anything from mobile equipment operators to plant operators to tradesmen, through to technicians, and the more technical professional skills, so everything from accounting to geology. We are putting in place apprenticeships, and we're working with various training facilities and providers within the region to, again, ensure that where there are any skills gaps, that those skills or those gaps can be filled.
Thank you, Victor. Another question that's come in, will Kalbar cover all road construction costs and maintenance costs during the life of the mine?
The short answer is yes. We will be required to pay for any modifications or realignments or diversions to roads. And that's been factored into our economic assessment of the project, so we've accounted for that. We'll also have to look at, is there a necessity to actually maintain roads? So for example, if we were to have B doubles using public roads on a daily basis, and there's wear and tear associated with that, we would be required to assist with the maintenance of those public roads. And again, I come back to a very strong preference to actually use a private haul road, which we would again construct and maintain for that form of transportation.
Thanks, Victor. The next question we have, I think you've answered in part, but there might be something that you're going to add. It's to do with skill sets again. It's, do you think you'll be able to source sufficient skilled miners from East Gippsland?
I think the short answer again is yes. We can, and as I said before, where we see gaps in skills, then we're prepared to train and develop people in order to employ them and utilize them for the activities that we anticipate. But there are certainly many transferable skills within the region that we can utilize.
Excellent, thank you. We just have one live question that's come in, and Tanya, I think this is for you. I think it's a follow-up to some comments that you just made, and the question is, how can Kalbar say that the surrounding Mindanao vegetable farms will not be impacted by contamination on high wind days, knowing that the wind station is situated in a gully?
Thanks, Josie. Well, there's a few points to consider in response to that one, I guess. The first is that the weather station actually has a wind speed and wind direction monitor located at 10 metres above ground. So that's quite high. So small variations in the terrain, we wouldn't expect to have a huge impact on the measurements that we're getting from it. And the weather station is set up in accordance with Australian standards, and we do expect that it's representative of the wider area. But it's also important that during operations, dust management on site would be informed by real-time monitoring of particulate levels around the mine. And that could easily include monitors close to the vegetable farms. So if dust levels were increasing, then changes could be made on site in response to that. And there's also weather forecast information that could let staff know when certain wind conditions are likely to occur, and make some changes before we get to a situation that could have high dust emissions. And so those tools would be used right from the beginning of the mine operations. So when the operations are still small in scale, so they provide a really good way of understanding the actual impacts as the mine progresses. So all of those things would mean it's unlikely that that you'd get adverse impacts in that area.
Great, thank you so much. And with that, we're going to move now to the next slide and go into the next theme. So we're now up to theme number 6, landscape and visual. And once again, Victor, the floor is yours to provide the summary findings. Thank you so much, Victor.
There we go. Landscape and visual. Key findings here is that while this is an agricultural setting, it is highly modified because there are things such as power lines, there's roads, there's buildings, there's also a fair number of plantations in the area. So those modifications are recognised as part of the visual impact assessment. There were quite a few viewpoints, both distant and local, that were looked at. So certainly the project will not have a visual impact on, if you were to go to some of the nearby tourist areas. The main visual impacts are really if you're driving through the project area, and also some of the residents that live adjacent to the project area. So there were 6 viewpoints associated mainly with residences where At different times, there was a moderate to high visual impact to those receptors. Now, there's a lot of mitigation that can be done to reduce those impacts. So things like screening with vegetation or earthen bunds, so visual bunds alongside roads is a very common use of, I guess, mitigating the impact of visual within mining areas. And other things that we will do would be using non-reflective cladding with respect to sort of the actual operating plants and other infrastructure, and muted paint tones that sort of blend in within the environment. And then lastly, it's ensuring that our lighting design reduces the actual amount of light spill. So rather than light flooding up, it's important that the light is directed to where it's needed and doesn't impact on people in the surrounding area. So with that, I will hand back to you in terms of any questions.
Drew. Thanks, Victor. We have two questions that have come through, and they both relate to some issues I think that you've just brought up. So one is, how will the mine affect the views in the district for residents and visitors, and what's going to be done to screen the mining area from view? So perhaps if you can elaborate on that a little bit more.
I think, well, as I say, for people that live close to the mine, and we've identified those where there'll be the greatest visual impact. The best thing we can do is to plant visual barriers, so vegetation that obscures their line of sight to the mine early on. The other thing, as I mentioned before, one of the key aspects in terms of reducing all of these impacts is ensuring that we follow progressive rehabilitation. And the sooner that we rehabilitate the landscape, the sooner these impacts, visual impacts, will fall away. And bear in mind that once you have done that and the mine moves on, then the impact on those receptors is fairly short-lived. So you're talking a period of a few years rather than the entire life of mine. And as I mentioned before, the use of visual bunds alongside roads is a very effective way of mitigating the visual impact. And so somebody actually driving through the project area or adjacent to it, once you have a visual bund that's grassed over and sitting behind some trees, you would hardly know that there was a mine there. And in fact, there's quite a few examples in WA where you don't actually know that there's a mineral sands mine. All you're seeing is actually a sort of a visual bund and some trees as you drive by.
Super. So earlier in the session, Victor, we had a question around noise pollution. And so I think we've got a similar one in with regards to light. So can you share us, what are the Victorian standards for light pollution?
Thanks, Josie. There is no applicable Australian standard to light settings or pollution. The methodology that we have used is drawn from the Institute of Lighting Engineers, and the guidance, oh, excuse me, is really that you look at reducing obtrusive light. And as I said before, what you want to ensure is that the light is directed down and towards where you need to have the light, and that you do not have light flooding the sort of localized area and creating light pollution.
Excellent. Victor, we just had a question come in. I think you might have partly answered it, but I just want to pose it to you just in case there's more you want to say. So the question we've just received is, What is the visual amenity impact? I think I pronounced that correctly. Don't have my glasses on. And how will you address that? Is it through tree screening?
Yeah,
It's visual amenity, sorry, my apologies.
Yeah,
I've got old eyes, Victor. Please go with me.
That's right. Yeah. I know exactly how you feel, having glasses as well. Yeah, as I said before, really the visual amenity is you can reduce or mitigate that impact through visual screening, and that's invariably by planting either vegetation to obscure the line of sight to the mine, or through visual bunds.
Okay, super. Victor, thank you so much. So Anthony, if we can go to the next slide, I think we'll move on to the next topic. And so coming up, we have cultural heritage. Once again, Victor, the floor is yours to provide the findings on cultural heritage. So thank you.
All right. Thank you. Again, 2 slides related to cultural heritage that I'll go through. So the key findings here are really that there are Aboriginal cultural heritage values that have been found and that are known within the project area, and also recognizing that there are unknown places within the project area that we need to be aware of. So for example, there was one heritage or listed or one site on the Aboriginal Heritage Register, which was a scar tree, which unfortunately that particular tree had been destroyed by fire in 2014. So that is a known registered site. We've also identified 3 Aboriginal sites through the surveying that we've conducted as part of this EES process. And we recognize that there are probably further sites that will be found as we do more detailed surveys and develop, as I'll come to, the Cultural Heritage Management Plan. And we have identified unrecorded surface stone artifacts through our surveys, and in fact we've also identified unrecorded subsurface stone artifacts at the site. So we know that they are there, and the important thing is how we then manage those particular sites, because these sites will be impacted by both the construction and operation of the mine. The location falls basically within either where we're going to locate infrastructure or where we will part of the mine path. So if we just go to the next slide. Thank you. So in essence, the critical thing that we need to do, and that we are now doing in conjunction with the registered Aboriginal party in the region, is to undertake and develop what is called a Cultural Heritage Management Plan, which really deals with, well, what are we going to do when we artifacts, and how are we going to ensure that our staff and contractors are adequately trained to deal with these, finding these artifacts. So overall, the residual risks and impacts for cultural heritage will be moderate or high because of the disturbance or destruction of artifact scatter within the project area. In terms of non-Indigenous culture, there's no heritage sites identified or registered. Our view is that if we do find any, as we progress through the project, then these will be dealt with through an archaeological management plan. Although we sort of feel that the risk of disturbing or destroying any identified non-Indigenous cultural heritage on the site is low. And with that, I'll hand back to you, Josie.
Thank you so much. I'm delighted as well to have on the line Ricky Feldman, who's from Andrew Long and Associates, and Ricky, I have several questions that have come through that I'm sure that you can help us gain a much better understanding about. So the first question you had is, how are sacred Aboriginal sites protected?
Thanks, Josie. Yes, so Aboriginal heritage sites, in general, all cultural heritage sites are protected by the Victorian Aboriginal Heritage Act and may only be harmed through the conditions of an approved cultural heritage management plan or cultural heritage permit. There's severe penalties in excess of $1.5 million that apply under the Act for not reporting on the discovery of or harming Aboriginal places, objects, or Aboriginal human remains. The Act also recognises Aboriginal people as the primary guardians, keepers of and knowledge holders of Aboriginal culture. The registered, registered Aboriginal Party are the organisations recognised under the Act with the responsibilities for the management and protection of the Aboriginal cultural heritage.
And so how will Kalbar manage Aboriginal sites?
Well, the Fingerboards project is, as Victor mentioned, that is required to prepare one of these Aboriginal cultural heritage management plans under the Act, and that's prior to the issuing of any permits that will ultimately allow the project to commence operation. And a CHMP is currently being prepared alongside the EES process, and the CHMPs, it'll continue to investigate the presence or absence of Aboriginal heritage sites through continuation of field assessments, both surface and subsurface, the refinement of the predictive model, and of course the continued consultation with the registered Aboriginal Party. And only after the approval of the CHMP, the project must comply with all of the conditions of the plan that might include site-specific and also general management conditions that are to be implemented before the project commences, during the project, and after the project has ended as appropriate. And the project must also implement, as Victor pointed out, contingency measures, which are essentially chance finds protocols that provide clear instruction that must be followed in the event that Aboriginal cultural heritage places or materials are discovered during the construction, operation, or indeed the decommissioning of the project.
Thanks, Ricky. The next question we have is, what are the most sensitive areas for Aboriginal heritage in the proposed mine area?
Yeah, okay. Well, there are a few things that we're using through the EES and the CHMP, the Cultural Heritage Management Plan. One, the site predictive model identifies areas of high ridges, which are the remnant dunes, also several alluvial terraces and fans along the incised gullies, as well as the interface between the upper planar surfaces, which are the large flat areas, and the steep gullies directly overlooking those gullies that they're probably considered the most likely to contain Aboriginal heritage.
What information do you have on Aboriginal sites at Fingerboards?
So far, as part of the ES and indeed the CHMP, the Cultural Heritage Management Plan, the investigation has included survey and subsurface testing. The results have broadly supported the model. The majority of artefacts identified, stone artefacts, 191 of them have been found in the dunes or the high ridges, 66 artefacts within the alluvial terraces and fans, and about 85 on the upper planar surfaces, with very few on the other landforms.
Okay, so Ricky, we just had a live question come in, and it's just probably something you can help us understand better. So does the CHMP have to be included in the EES?
Generally speaking, an approved CHMP is not a requirement of the EES. Demonstration that a CHMP is indeed underway, which it certainly is, given that we've done what is referred to in the CHMP as a standard assessment and part of the complex assessment or the subsurface investigation that's still ongoing. So in short, no, an approved CHMP isn't required at this stage.
Okay, Ricky, thank you so much. For now, that's the questions that we have. Anthony, we'll go to the next slide so we can begin the next section. We're going into the 8th theme now, and the 8th theme focuses on mine rehabilitation and closure. And once again, I'd like to welcome Victor back. Victor, probably for the last time this evening, to present some findings. So why don't you take the floor?
All right, thanks, Josie. I might just following on from that question. So the CHMP is required to be approved before what is called a works plan is granted by Earth Resources. So as we, on the basis that we get through the EES gate, the next step is to apply for what is called a mine work plan. And that does require an approved CHMP. So that's why we're now working at finalising the CHMP.
Super, thank you, Victor. Really appreciate your clarification on that. So thank you.
All right. So I'll just run through the key findings of the rehabilitation and closure. It's worth mentioning that we plan to have 2 active mine voids operating for most of the life of the mine, and that each of these mine voids is something in the order of 60 hectares at any given time. And as I spoke about previously, it's really important that we follow progressive rehabilitation of the site as these mine voids move through the project area. So on average, there will be 80 hectares of rehabilitation occurring every year. Some years there'll be more than others, and it really depends on the specific activities in any given year. But the intention is that by 5 years after the completion of mining, that the site will be well and truly rehabilitated, or in the case of where we're doing restoration, that restoration will be well and truly underway. The main risk factors and impacts associated with rehabilitation are associated with erosion or land stability, and the fact that the plants that we plant in the rehabilitated areas fail. So a lot of the work that we are doing and will continue to do is around ensuring that there is ground stability and that there's also productivity associated with the vegetation that we plan to plant as part of our rehabilitation plans. And I should say also that when we look at rehabilitation, it effectively starts now. It is very much part and parcel of the planning process and running all the way through construction and operations. So it's not, rehabilitation is not for us an afterthought after we finish mining. It is very much part and parcel of what, on how we actually plan to mine the area. The other areas where risks have been identified that are important is that we plan to realign a number of roads within the project area, and we plan to use the overburden or alternatively the sand tailings as for what is called road pillars. So that's basically what is underlying the roads, and there's a fair amount of geotechnical work that needs to go into how those pillars are designed, and also essentially the geotechnical properties, because there is a risk that if those pillars are not stable, then there will be road damage in terms of cracks or warping or subsidence. And so there's a fair amount of work that we're doing in terms of the design and management, oh, excuse me again, of those road bases, as it were. If we follow the mitigations associated with rehabilitation, the overall residual impact or risks are considered to be both, or either low or very low. As we mentioned before, and with as we will do with other aspects of the project, monitoring that's now started and that will be ongoing is crucial to understanding how effective our rehabilitation and closure plans are, and whether we are tracking with the criteria that we will set for rehabilitation, and in particular, if we're handing land back to a landowner, ensuring that any criteria that we've agreed up front is being met. So the monitoring aspect and management of that is critical in my mind. And as an overarching, I suppose, management tool, we will have what is called an environmental management framework that we will implement, and that environmental management framework has been developed and will be submitted as part of the EES report and associated documents.
Yeah, I appreciate that summary very much. So let's go straight to the questions. The first one I think is perfect for Rob Locke from Landlock. Rob, we have a question that says, what do you mean by continual rehabilitation?
Thanks, Josie. I think really Victor has, to a degree, answered that tonight. He's spoken quite regularly about progressive rehabilitation. It means simply that rehabilitation follows mining, and the area that's rehabilitated each year is similar to the area that's disturbed. And in mining, this is regarded as best rehabilitation practice. In fact, a couple of years ago, the Queensland government legislated to put a lot more pressure on miners to do exactly that. If you're doing progressive rehabilitation, you find that mines develop skilled teams who are out there doing rehabilitation. They've got trained staff, they've got equipment developed and available. The techniques that are used are evaluated, they're refined, so that within a relatively short period of a number of years, you've normally got a very, very functional team and getting very, very reliable results. It also means that if there is a problem or a failure, it's not a large area, and to fix it quickly is not difficult. So yeah, absolute best practice.
Thank you, Rob, appreciate that. And thank you for giving that insight as well about what some governments are doing. Rob, can I come back to you? We have another question.
Yes, sure.
Can you provide a list of mineral sands mines on dispersive soils that have been successfully rehabilitated?
Now, start by saying that a lot of mineral sands mines, by and large, are mining materials that are sandy at the surface, and it's the same for the Fingerboards project. There is dispersive subsoil, and across Australia we have the highest frequency of dispersive subsoils of any country in the world, so they bob up everywhere. Now, the topsoil at the Fingerboards is a sand, it's not dispersive. Some of the subsoils are. In fact, some of them are so terrible, we don't intend to use them in rehabilitation. We're much more interested in finding substitute materials that will be much better in terms of supporting plant growth and with much better water balances. Now that will include some tailings, materials and possibly some overburdens. The overburdens are dispersive, but they will be treated with gypsum to reduce their exchangeable sodium levels and to largely eliminate dispersion. So this is an issue that's been worked on through rehabilitation and construction, mining, gas pipelines, right across Australia. And the methods for getting it right are well established, and I think the methods for getting it wrong are equally well known. People do know what not to do. In terms of mineral sands mines which have worked with dispersive topsoils, the only one that comes to my mind is the ginkgo mine in southwestern New South Wales. And despite all of that and very trying climate, it's actually achieved brilliant rehabilitation.
Excellent, thank you, Rob. I have two more questions that have just come in that follow up on some comments that you made. So let's go to those while we see if we can get Paul back. So the first one is progressive rehabilitation legislated as a requirement in Victoria?
No, not to my knowledge.
Okay, that's a quick one. Should we go to the next one? How long will each mined area take to rehabilitate?
This is one of the perennial questions in rehabilitation. Obviously, it takes, if your definition of full rehabilitation is a 20-metre high tree, the answer is it's a very long time. What you find is done with rehabilitation generally is to monitor and, where necessary, apply remedial actions so that a rehabilitated ecosystem is on a very well-defined trajectory to reach the target situation. So this is an area where there's been an enormous amount of work and a lot of experience. Probably, to be really confident, depending on the ecosystem, if it's simple, probably maybe 5 years. If it's a complex ecosystem, it might be 10 to 20, but it varies enormously depending upon just what is the target.
Thank you so much for that, Rob. Now I think Paul is arguably not. Paul, are you there? Can you? So if not, I tell you what we're going to do. We're going to go to the, we've got 3 extra questions that have come in. We have a little bit of time. So what I'd like to do is we will ask the 3 extra questions that have come in, and then we're going to go back and see if we can get Paul. And if we can't, we're going to go to Joseph, who's got some questions he's going to answer too. So first question, Victor, this is for you, linked to resource development. So you talked about some of the benefits. So the question that we have is, were you able to break down the regional versus statewide versus Australia benefits?
Thanks, Josie. Can you hear me?
I can, absolutely.
All right.
Thank you.
Great. Just before I answer that question, I might just, following on from that question to Rob regarding rehabilitation, make 2 comments. One is that we anticipate that areas will be rehabilitated. So from the point where you dig a hole to the point where you can hand back the land, to say that, let's say a farmer will be something in the order of 3 to 5 years in our case. There are examples in Western Australia where land is pretty much producing, has crops growing on it, grass for hay, within 2 years, 18 months to 2 years after mining. So, we think that 3 to 5 years is a realistic target given what can be achieved elsewhere. So I just wanted to add that to Rob's answer.
Thank you.
So yes, from memory, and I think to some extent I'll have to take this question on notice and provide it in the written answer, but certainly on a regional and a state basis, there is a breakdown in terms of benefits from this project. So from an economic point of view, that has been determined. Please do not ask me to provide the numbers for that breakdown here, because I just don't have them on hand.
So what we'll do though, Victor, is we'll get that number and we'll include it in the Q&A. Excellent. I have a follow-up call for, follow-up question, pardon me, for Ricky. Ricky, can you just clarify for the audience, what exactly is a CHMP?
Yes, certainly. A CHMP, it stands for a Cultural Heritage Management Plan. It's a requirement when a certain high impact activity is planned in an area of cultural heritage sensitivity, or indeed in this instance, it's also required where an EES is required. These are things defined by the Aboriginal Heritage Regulations to the Aboriginal Heritage Act. And basically what it is, it's a written report prepared by a heritage advisor that includes results of an assessment, whether it's desktop survey, subsurface testing, or all three, as in this instance. And it essentially outlines conditions that the sponsor has to fulfill before, during, and after the activity.
Excellent. Thank you. Thanks for clarifying that for us. The last question for this part of the webinar, Victor, I think this is for you. It could go to Tanya. So this could be the only question where we actually want to pass it to someone else. It's about to do with the comments on amenity and environmental quality. What chemical suppressants will be used? Victor?
Sorry, Josie, I'm just taking myself
That's
off
okay.
mute. From memory, Josie, I think it's something like magnesium sulfate. It's a standard dust suppressant. There's a whole range of commercial brands that can be used, and I'm pretty sure it's magnesium sulfate. If not, we will ensure that we clarify that and provide that in the written answers.
Greatly. So we're almost to the end of the webinar. So I just want to thank people, especially all the experts that have joined us. We're going to just go to the next slide now, Anthony, if we can. So thanks everyone for joining. And we are going to ask Joseph to come back. So thank you for joining me tonight. I've just realised though that Anthony, we might need to move the camera. That's okay. It's been a long day for Anthony here on the So Joseph, thanks again for joining me for the wrap up tonight. We also received a couple of questions that I think are really relevant for you. And before we go into the next steps for the project, I'm wondering if you could just help people understand. We've got a number of questions that have asked, how do people get jobs at Kalbar, and what's the process they should use? I'm just wondering if you maybe could just share that for the people at home.
Yeah, sure. And look, just before I answer the question, I guess it's important to note that we are talking about 200 jobs during the construction phase, which is probably going to take us over a 12 or so month period, and then in terms of ongoing operations, it's an ongoing 200 jobs, and that the life of mine is sort of 14 to 15 years, and it's important to note that these type of deposits tend to be multi-generational. So it's a very good question, which I'd like to answer. And look, there's a couple of ways. One is to visit our website and register your interest on the website. That's probably the easiest way, because we've got a lot of people that are sort of registering now, and we have a database of CVs that we're tracking. I guess the other thing is we do have the office here in Bairnsdale, and if someone wanted to drop in their resume, that's also another way of doing it. So there's a couple of avenues there, but I would encourage anyone that is interested to register now.
Excellent. Thank you. So what I'd like you to do is let's go to the next slide if we can, Anthony. I want to talk about where we are in the process. We've received several questions about what happens next.
Okay.
And I do think that it is important for us just to paint a clear picture. So particularly, I know that there are some community members who have been with Kalbar on this journey for the last 18 months or 2 years. And I know that Kalbar is grateful for that input and participation, but perhaps for people who maybe have only recently heard about the project or have joined this webinar as one of the first ways to learn, I'm wondering if you could just explain where we are in the process and what happens next and what role people can play moving forward.
Sure. Yeah, look, and the journey has been, I think it's been more like three and a bit years, so it's been quite some time. As you can see on the slide that's up at the moment, we've got an arrow showing, where we are, and where we are is really on the doorstep of going to public exhibition of the EES. So I've sort of been on radio recently and commented on the EES itself, and it is quite a substantial document. And everyone you've heard from tonight has had input into that, all the technical experts putting the studies together. So we're talking in excess of, once you've put all the reports together with appendices, it's 8,500 pages. So it's quite a document, but all of that is condensed into a summary document, which is still quite significant. I think that's in the order of 800 plus pages. But where we are is we're working closely with government. We don't actually set the date for when that is exhibited, but we are hopeful that it is close, which is why we're actually doing a lot of the bulletins in the paper. We're holding this event here to make sure people are prepared to when they receive it. It'll actually be exhibited for a period of 40 days, which has been set by the government. After that 40-day period, we go into what's called a public inquiry, and there'll be a panel put together, and submissions can be made by members of the community or groups based on what they've read in the EES, and put that to the panel, and then the panel will draw on the technical experts and the company to then answer any questions that have come up, and then they'll make a recommendation to the minister.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Joseph. We've come to the end. We've come to the end of our session. Anthony, if you don't mind moving, to the next slide. Joseph, thanks so much for joining. I really appreciate your time. I'd also like to express my thanks to all of the experts that have joined us tonight, and most importantly to everyone at home who's joined to learn more through our webinar. We're particularly grateful for people that have taken the time to submit questions, both in the lead up to tonight's session and real time during this evening. We are disappointed in it that we can't answer all the questions, but just time is against us. As I said earlier, we will respond to all the questions we've received from you, whether about the project specifically or indeed anything about that around Kalbar. And I think those couple of questions about jobs and the way to go about it is a good example of that. That Q&A document will be published on the website within 7 working days. A recording of this webinar with all the glitches will be available that you can watch again either on the YouTube channel or via the website. On your screen at the moment is the URL for you to go to the Fingerboards project website. If you have further questions about any of the issues that have been raised today, I encourage you to go there. There is a wealth of information, including a video that has some good explanations about many of the issues and the topics that we've discussed this evening. I think I can say safely on behalf of Kalbar, if anyone does have any further questions, please contact Kalbar directly, and they will be very happy to either clarify any questions you have or help you understand things better. So I'd like to also express my thanks to Anthony, the technology wonder, for keeping us going and keeping us on time. We've come to the end of our webinar. Thank you so much, and I wish you a very pleasant evening. Thank you.